Hello, my gorgeous, beautiful, wonderful ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else. I hope you're doing well. I get asked often, Yamato, does Los Ratones have what it takes to compete in the LEC? Does Velia have what it takes to compete in the LEC? Could he be good enough to join a team today? And I figured I would just make a video from the perspective of someone that has worked in the LEC now and competed in League for 15 years. I am one of the coaches that has, the most coach games in LEC history. I believe I'm second place, right behind Dylan now because he's stacking them now in G2. I was in Korea, went to Worlds a couple of times, and on top of that, I've watched all of the most recent LEC games all the way back to I don't know how many years, and on top of that, also watched all the Los Ratones games, which matters. But I think it's important before we talk about, their individual potential, their team's potential. I think it's important to talk about the fundamental differences of being in the LEC. Scrimming on stream is, of course, a massive penalty in terms of, all of the things that you need to maneuver around. We saw when C9 and Flag were streamed on stream, they weren't acting natural. They needed to behave a certain way, hold a certain image, and also at the same time be very entertaining to, of course, their fan base. And this is something that the Los Ratones team has mastered. This is a very, very entertaining project. Everyone's bought into it and everyone's super, super excited to watch them play due to the personalities there and how great streamers, the majority of them are, like I say the majority, all of them are. I don't know why I said majority, but I'm not going back and remaking this video because I just want to make my thoughts as streamlined as possible. With that in mind, they are succeeding, winning the NLC, they're winning the EMEA Masters in spite of that. This is an anchor that is holding them down. If they only streamed, didn't stream at all when they scrimmed and they got to scrim against better opponents and they managed to, prepare the strats offline, they would be even more vicious in this tournament. So they're managing to succeed in spite of that. When you're in the LEC, you get to practice the LEC schedule, you get to play competition consistently, right? In most cases, unless it's a best of one format and teams get eliminated because they're 9th and 10th place. You get to scrim in the LEC and you don't need to, of course, focus on the streaming. And I think that is a fundamental difference, right? So obviously, a lot of these players would be even better in that context. Most of them would be better. I say most of them because I can't imagine Baos, for example, enjoying the LEC schedule because it can be very, gruesome because that's the level that you're playing at. That's the level that you're operating at. Even the teams that might be underperforming, they're still putting in a shit ton of hours. And I'm not saying the Los Ratones aren't, but of course, when your hustle and your job is to be very entertaining on stream, that demands a lot of effort and energy from you. And a person like Baos has insane amount of positive energy and always pulls up the vibe and always brings up, the energy in the team in a lot of cases and is very, very consistent in his mood. That is something that takes effort, being a great streamer takes a lot of effort. I don't believe in a world where someone just randomly has success. I think that Baos has really mastered, what he does. The same thing when you're in the LEC, you have to put all of that energy into, of course, performing. And that is sometimes for some people, a different skill set. And I think that could be, difficult for Baos because I do think that he seems to be a person that really, really enjoys his freedom. But I just wanted to outline the differences in terms of competing and practicing in the LEC because most teams run, at least like 10 hours of the day scheduled, maybe 10, maybe 8 in some cases, depends on the team, but a minimum amount of scrims, you have meetings, you have sometimes physical exercise, you have additional meetings, and you have team stuff, and I can expand on this conversation a very, very long time. But let's begin. So Nemesis is the easy one, on top of together with Crowney. I think Nemesis, if he joined the league and he scrimmed very, very hard, I think the main thing for me in terms of Nemesis as a player, I do think that he has actually found ways to improve on some points that maybe would be his weakness in the past. I do think that when Nemesis played, he was a top 2 mid laner because, he played against like prime caps, fair play to him. At the time, Nemesis, I think, was a top 2 mid laner and was the guy who was competing with caps, who occasionally Larson did too. 2020 in playoffs was something that stood out. This was some of the rookie years for both Nemesis and Larson. And then Humanoid ramped up and played a lot better in 2021. Of course, that was basically like the class of new mid lane rookies. I think the main thing, looking back at Nemesis back then, I do think that he kind of had, he was kind of like European Chovy in a way, like the real, the meme version of how people viewed Chovy, where he just farms and wants to reach certain breakpoints to then carry the game. And if there was chaos around him, he wouldn't adjust to it. And I think Nemesis was very similar. Very, very masterful laner. If he could play his game, he would love to. But we all remember those videos of like Hilly wanting to find angles and had to convince people with his body. And now, looking at Nemesis today, he still has that insane skill when it comes to, of course, lane phase and so forth. But on top of that, I do think that he has mastered the idea of carrying the game through others, and it's very, very clear that he has developed and honed his skills and has added additional layers of how to be like a teammate that actually carries games when it comes to the officials, which I think is super, super massive. Obviously, being the younger Nemesis on the Fnatic roster in 2020, for example, that was a very, very turbulent roster. That was, that like the stories you would hear from inside that roster, and also like the worlds of course, in China when it was like COVID lockdown and so forth. That was like, in terms of the pain that they went through as a group is absolutely crazy. But those are not my stories to tell. I think that Nemesis has gotten a lot better even from those times, even though he was really, really good in those times too. I don't think that Nemesis has any flaws in terms of the champions that he plays. I think that he is super, super good at almost every aspect of the game. And I think that if he played on a team in the LEC, I could see him being like a top 3, top 4 mid laner. And I think that he would just do super, super well. That's the easy one. I think for Crowney, I think the same can be said, but I do think that the ADC pool is very, very competitive, especially with Super being a lot better now. I think that Super, we have Kalist, you have, of course, Hans Sama, you have Upset, you have even players like Noah. I do think that the AD carry pool is a lot more competitive. I do think that Crowney is still good enough to compete and be in the LEC. But I do think that, Nemesis would just be like at a higher premium due to, of course, market circumstances and, of course, player pool circumstance and also just skill, just raw skill. I think Nemesis is really, really there. But I think that Crowney definitely, in terms of what I mentioned before, I think if Crowney had the LEC regiment and he had a support also that was on that LEC regiment, I do think that Crowney's skill would just increase so much more. So there is a world where Crowney definitely like surpasses some of the names that I mentioned, but Crowney definitely has the capacity to be like an LEC level player and be competitive. I think the main thing is that I think that he would benefit so much from the LEC schedule in terms of his raw talent and skill, because obviously I can see that, being a streamer, like if he can focus only on the game, he would just be so much more insane, I think some people would perform better in that liberty of streaming and just doing that as a lifestyle and doing that well and having that being fused together with their gameplay. But my read on Crowney is that if he had that LLC schedule, he would just be really, really insane. Reckless is a very unique one because obviously I do think that Reckless is like the ADC GOAT in LEC history. It's like the other only name that could compare maybe is Sven, right? And Reckless had just a fantastic career. His opening year was MVP. 2015 Reckless in summer was insane. Also later down the line, when he did the Fnatic runs, 2020 Fnatic, absolutely insane Reckless performances. I can go on and on and on. The main thing that stood out about Reckless as a player, especially in the ADC pool, was he was very, very good at really leaning into what he believed were his strengths and figuring out the puzzle that was in his mind, basically the depiction of the game and that puzzle. Like if the game was a puzzle, he would solve it his own way. He was the master of few. He would stick to a few champions, hold on to them for their life. And even though other players would not get away with playing those certain champions in those matchups, his mastery and effort in achieving that mastery made him so much better than most players on those champions. Whether it was the Senna, the Tristana, the Sivir, even Jin in the beginning, even earlier days, it was the likes of Kalista. It all depended on what the meta and what the read was. Cannon was also a super, super big one. He put in so much effort and time into mastering his specific champions, and he stayed in his comfort, which I think is Reckless's biggest strength, but also sometimes his weakness, where I think there are opportunities in Fearless where breaking outside of your comfort could be the best decision that you can take. And I believe in those moments that if he went along with it, that he would actually be able to perform. But I think it's very, very important for Reckless as a player to feel very, very comfortable in what his vision and what his impact will be in the game, right? And I think that in terms of the translation from his support role to the LEC level, I do think that in the LEC, that would be a lot more challenged, right? I think on the NLC level, the EMEA Master level, when Reckless is playing his champs in a good draft, in a good angle that he believes in, whether it's the Bard or the Rakan, he is really, really insane. Mechanically, super, super crisp, plays the fight super well, is a very booming voice in, of course, the comms, and has found ways to, of course, support Nemesis on side because of Velia's heavy farming style, almost like a little bit inspired of like the carrier-owner relationship we saw in previous years. It makes sense that he takes inspiration from there. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because I think the main challenge would be if Reckless wants to become or would want to become a top support in the LEC, is that when he's faced with the decision of, breaking comfort to do something stylistically in a draft that is going to, win the game, if he breaks out of that, I think that he could be super, super good. But if not, I do think that teams would begin to recognize his patterns as a player and try to push him off his comfort in terms of, his patterns in terms of what he chooses to pick. And I think that would make or break how good Reckless would be at the end of things in terms of, listing him in the top 10 supports. But I think mechanically, he's super, super good, has the experience. I think that he has a good vision for the game. I think sometimes there are moments where watching Los Ratones, I feel like Nemesis and Crowney almost need to force their teammates into fights and into situations and into, of course, game-winning decisions. And I think that could also be a slight criticism. But I think that ties into, of course, the initial thing. I think it's very clear when Reckless is comfortable and he feels the idea and his vision for the game, then he just plays like an S+ player. But when he's uncomfortable, that's where things get a little bit tougher, right? So as a team, of course, you can set up any player for success and you can find that comfort and you can play for that. And we have players that, might be similar, of course, in the LEC. There are still players in the LEC that play within a certain window, certain context, and of course, a certain, condition to perform. That's very, very common. You have players like Hansam or like Labrov as well. These are players that really, really play well in certain contexts. And in certain contexts, they are going to be less impactful. But I think that's true for almost anyone. The players that are good in a lot of aspects of the game and in a lot of conditions, those are your elite level players, right? These are the players that are meta-proof, and they are the ones that can branch out mid-series, like we see, for example, where a player like Chovy nowadays, the reason he's considered like a perfect damn player is because he can go in the melee direction, playing the Akali, playing the Yone, and then he can go into the mage direction, playing the Victor and Azir and Talia, and then he can also just pull off a game 5 Zoe and look like he's an OTP. And he can play Ryze the game before, and the only thing he doesn't play really is Syndra and Orianna, but he compensates by playing every damn other champion in the game, Galio, and that thing is that is simply nuts. That is simply nuts. But definitely, Reckless has the talent to be able to play. But I think that making him uncomfortable would be like a goal for teams, and I think that could be like a point of you know potential strategy for teams with of course that are facing up against a team with reckless, right? And I do think that fearless puts even a heavier strain on that. I know that the teams in EMA Masters aren't as capable of figuring that out, but there were moments where, even like when they were trying to piece it together with Velia and of course, Reckless, you remember like the Sally drafts, people say Sally drafts and so forth, but there are moments where, Velia's playing a supportive champion and then they're playing a weaker lane on bot because they are looking to scale on bottom side and they aren't capable of blind picking the strongest support to set up the lane for success, whether that's like a Nautilus or in the past maybe a Rel or something like this. Those are the moments where I think that Los Ratones were tested, right? It's like those iffy games. If you guys remember like the Maokai or the Vi Jungle games, there were a lot of them, especially in the previous split. But I think that Los Ratones are now a lot more aware about what they want Velia to play, and they are letting him choose a little bit more, like we saw with the Lee Sin and the Kazakhs. We don't see him play Maokai that much. We don't see him play Vi Jungle at all anymore, right? He's playing the carries, what he's comfortable on. And that's something that the team is piecing together and figuring out. And that, of course, matters, In this entire context, there's going to be players that on a certain team will be able to be winners. On certain teams, they're going to be a lot worse because the things that are within the team are not there to cover their weaknesses or not even there to maybe highlight their strengths either. An example could be Caps right now. Caps on G2 currently, the team is not built in a way to highlight his strengths, which makes him look weaker, right? In the sense that his jungle and support are not players that want to give all of their effort to Caps, making sure that he's on a pedestal and then creating a scenario where he's ahead and he dominates the game. Labrov and Skymond are more, let's say, selfish players in the sense that they want to drive the game through themselves. Hansama, Labrov want to play winning lanes. Skymond wants to carry the jungle through him, but if he's behind, he's not so dynamic and doesn't find opportunities through his teammates. And that's a context where I think the GOAT of the game is, of course, looking weaker than usual. Not the GOAT of the game, but GOAT of course, Europe. I know someone's going to be like, oh, go to the game, Caps. Are you crazy, Yamato? Caps is definitely a top 10er, though. Top 10er. Back-to-back finals, MSI trophy, most amount of splits won out of anybody. Come on now. Should matter. All right. Velia. That's the one that comes up often because there was speculation. Will Velia move to a team? Will he join LEC? Velia, there are moments where, I think in terms of mechanical play, I think his confidence in fights, when it comes to the Kindreds or the Kazakhs or the Lee Sins, I do think that aspect of his play is, of course, his strongest point. Is definitely his strongest point. I think that if he has the freedom to farm and then to just show up to fights, I think he performs good, right? But I do think that in terms of carrying games, this was something that Broken Blade mentioned on our Sackdown episode, where Yike needed to work on carrying games, meaning that if he's ahead and he's strong and he wants to pick a carry in a game, he needs to demand the right things and also give timers and opportunities for his team to actually retake the map and make sure that they farm. In the process of farming and carrying, you need to make sure that, you spread the wealth, meaning that everybody eats. In some cases, you need to skip camps and do them on the exit, and you need to go to a wave and make sure that your mid laner can farm a neutral wave, and then you go back to take your camps, and you need to find a very beautiful balance in making sure that everyone's in tune with your own game idea. And what I'm describing is a challenge that any player goes through. It's like how to communicate your idea and making everyone align, because base timers, gold distribution, all of these things need to align so your opportunities are best used. If I as a jungler say, all right, I want to clear these 6 camps, I'm going to base and I'm going to have Black Cleaver and then I'm going to play on this wave, and then on this wave I want you to be ready. You have a solid 45 seconds, make sure to push, make sure to base. That's like a very, very clear call. Everyone's going to be ready then when I am strong, and everyone knows the idea to tune into. Outside of game is a very easy thing to say, and I can point this out over and over again, but I've worked with many junglers where they struggle with this thing, and I'm sure this is something that the Los Ratones are also working on too. There was a moment in the game against BKR where there was a moment of frustration between Velia and the bot lane, and sometimes the bot lane, kind of tilt and say, "Oh, you guys need to help us. We need to play around me. Like I am the president in the game," and so forth. I'm not bringing this up to draw shade to anybody. Like, we are very privileged that we get to see every aspect of this team. This is a very, very common thing. And when you are watching, of course, them playing the live games, this is them being very vulnerable, very, very vulnerable, right? It's like in a team setting, you should be allowed to be as vulnerable as possible, because you should be able to express the deepest version of yourself. Your passion needs to pour through, and you need to be able to be honest at every level, not only with your words, but honest in terms of how you act and react. And in that moment, right, there's frustration, because I think the frustration stems from the fact that when Velia is farming, he's not giving a clear outline for when his teammates are actually allowed to play the game. And in most cases, the bot lane fend for themselves super well. Baos plays his game and he gets information through the jungle when he dies. Nemesis is brilliant at pushing waves and understanding when to press and when not to press based on very limited information. And that's something that they get away with. But if you play at an LEC level, this becomes like the most important thing. And you notice it extremely hard that when you play at an LEC level or a higher level, that skipping these beats, skipping those moments to farm, you get a lot more punished, because individual players are better, individual players are better, and also teams are a lot more sharper at playing on tempo and pushing you out and making sure that you are visionless. And I think this would just be the biggest challenge for Velia. I think Velia is mechanically talented, and I think that's usually like the indicator of what your potential can be. But there's definitely like some work to be done there, because then again, the jungle pool in Europe is quite intense and very competitive. If you think about it, you have the likes of Skymon, Yike, Elioya, sure, you can point to someone like Isma and Skymon, but, sorry, not Skymon, but Bukada. But this is also, someone like Isma is also someone that dominated in an ERL level, or did well in an ERL level, and then tried to move up and struggle with those same things, because everything just happens way faster. Your decisions need to be a lot more sharp, and your teammates getting punished is not something that you can allow as a jungler. Junglers have the most punishing job, even more extreme so the deeper the game goes in terms of level, right? The funny thing is, at the absolute highest level, it kind of goes back to the same idea though, where everyone is so precise, like let's say top LCK or top LPL, where the teams are so precise that you deviating to try to find opportunities can also be punishing. So it's like the game becomes more streamlined then. But I do think that this would be like the number one thing for Velia to work on. It's like, how as a player does he envision the game, and how does he make sure that his teammates align in that, and also how does he make sure that his teammates actually farm and he gives them opportunities to actually breathe. And because if you're ahead, you need to make sure that the whole map feels good. You can't, as a top laner, if you're winning top and you want to win the game, to stay top as your, map burns. You gotta find those clear-cut opportunities where you spike. It's like, oh, I'm going to reach level 6 first. Here we go. There was a Wukong invade they did, which was super, super good. I think in terms of the early game, Velia is improving super much, which is super clear. His chicken awareness, his buff awareness is something that he has improved on massively. I think that would be like the number one thing that is improved on this year, like his camp awareness and his, idea of, pushing for the invades. But in regards to how the mid game and the late game plays out, this is where he needs some work. But then again, I repeat, him being on an LEC schedule would, of course, rapidly, really, put speed onto this process in terms of improving. But I think that jump for Velia would require, of course, a lot of support from his teammates to be able to pull that off. Because I remind you, players like Skymond and Yike, they came into the league as super hype prospects of being like the focal point of their ERL team, winning the competitions that they were in, besides maybe, some of them. And then they were insanely high ranked too, like being like top rank, like Skymon being like rank 1 player. This is the level of junglers are being moved up to the league, and they also have things that they need to learn and figure out. People know the points and the criticism that I bring up against a player like Yike in the earlier parts of his career, or the criticism that I levy towards, of course, Skymond, who is very, very early on in his career. Criticism sounds harsh, but basically like things that they need to work on. And Skymon is very, very early in his career, and I believe that he's going to achieve those things, and he's going to be able to get to that point. But I do think that the context of the level matters super, super much. I've seen a lot of ER players do very, very well, and I've seen them, of course, move up and they do nothing. So jungle is a very, very brutal role, super the same way, because the game is just very, very different. And it's all about hitting beat after beat after beat after beat. And if you miss a beat, the whole music stops and your teammates can no longer breathe and play, and it can be game-changing, game-changing completely. Finally, Baos. Baos. I think there's a lot of things that he does better than anybody else. Meaning his understanding of when to proxy, when to play waves. I think mechanically on certain champions, I do think that, he has OTP status, like really pristine status on certain champions in terms of interactions, like his Sion, his Gragas. I think on a mechanical level, I think he's better than anyone else in Europe on these particular champions. That's very, very specific to those in terms of like knowing mechanical ranges and just understanding the depth of your champion. I think when it comes to lane phase, I think that's where he struggles. In terms of understanding jungle, I think that's where he struggles. And I think that being in a losing position is definitely one where he struggles. Sometimes he manages to figure it out in a beautiful way, even in a losing position, because he's a win all or lose all type player, meaning that if he is in a bad matchup, he's going to look to proxy, going to, of course, look to extend situations, bait bases, and go deep and look to find ways to not interact. But if this fizzles out, then it gets a little bit trickier. But at the same time, Baos is, of course, super, super much improved. I think Baos would be hurt by the LEC schedule. I don't think that would suit him too much. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that the LEC schedule would suit him. I do think that in terms of laning, like that's usually the number one door you need to get through as a top laner. I think it's extremely brutal because you are often playing in isolation. And laning level 1, 2, 3 is like the most purest form of top lane. And I do think this is where a lot of the top laners in Europe would just decimate Baos. And I do think when he's playing situations in a matchup where he's comfortable and he gets out of those situations and he gets his rhythm going, that rhythm, that music that he plays, nobody is better at it. Nobody is better at playing the music that Baos sings, Whether it's like the proxy game or the Cho'Gath game, I do think that mechanically, strictly mechanically, on his execution of some of these champions, it's just pristine, But I don't think that Baos would function super, super well on an LEC level. I think he would be the one who would struggle potentially the most. In regards to the team as a whole, I do think that they are held together by the fact that in a lot of cases, they do a lot more than should be possible. And I think that goes for every player. I think that Nemesis in most cases stands out. I do think that in a world where Nemesis is playing against players on an even level as him, I do think that the challenges of the jungle support synergy and making sure that you cover the map and open the map and you make sure that you clear vision, put vision really cleanly together, because the enemy it plays a lot faster on the LEC. I think that would be like the biggest challenge. But I can definitely see a world where the current Los Ratones can beat some of the lower end teams in like a SK or the Navi that is being built now on the sheer force of super good macro knowledge, and also having enough of a draft pool to take from to find draft scenarios where they can cover for their weaknesses against some of the lower end teams. But I think cracking the top 5 would be very difficult. I would be very impressed if they did with the current roster that they have. But these are just my thoughts on how I believe the players would do in the LEC if they moved over, with some background in terms of how it ties into the current state of the LEC and so forth. I think it's an interesting conversation. I do think that this team has done such a good job, especially Keiru, right, of really making sure that the team is very marketable, very fun, and outgoing. And the fact that they managed to win while doing all of these things is extremely impressive. Very impressive. And I don't think that anything should be taken away from that, because they're doing most things publicly and that they're streaming. And I do think that streaming and scrimming at the same time is something that is very draining. It's something that is difficult, and I don't think that a lot of people know how to manage or can even manage that well. So a lot of props for them to be being able to do so. And I do think that playing in the LEC, doing the LEC schedule and competing in the LEC, of course, challenges a very different skill set. And I hope that this conversation explored some of those topics. But this is a great squad, and if all of them individually play in the LEC, I'm rooting for them, and of course I would wish them to do breakthrough and find new ceilings and new barriers. So there's that. Thank you very much for watching. If you made it to the end, I wish you a pleasant day, night, whatever. Maybe you listen to this before sleep. If you're already dreaming and you put me as your sleep timer, I wish and I will make sure that your dreams are gentle and kind. You're going to wake up refreshed. All the best.